had gambled everything in the Ardennes, his best troops, his new reserves, hundreds of new tanks, and his meager supply of fuel. But he'd always known that wasn't enough. He'd also counted on bad weather, and after 7 days, his luck had run out.
The German offensive stalled out. The Allies held the northern shoulder. In the south, the southern shoulder was held. The Germans were constricted to that 80-mile base, and driving toward Antwerp, they got no farther than just within sight of the Meuse River. Net effect was it died right there. That was the end of it.
Patton's army got to Bastogne the day after Christmas, and they opened up enough of a hole for the press to squeeze through, along with the morale troops and the medal pinners. McAuliffe and the 101st were the pride of the American army. But the price of an earlier pride was also on display. An army which had held itself unstoppable had suffered 4,000 dead in the Bulge by Christmas. 30,000 more Americans had been wounded or taken prisoner. The SS had executed hundreds of unarmed American prisoners, and in the town of Stavelot, more than 100 Belgian civilians. The Americans had given up a pocket of land 50 miles deep. It would take them a whole month to win it back.
Your imagination kind of runs away with you, I guess, especially when you hear noises. And of course at night it was worse because you really didn't know what was happening.
We were very much afraid of the dark. You couldn't see the danger. And so as the light begins to come, it's beautiful. It provides you at least a view of what's going to happen. And you know what's going to happen in terms of the battle.
To meet the German drive, General Eisenhower here at Supreme Headquarters resourcefully regrouped his forces, giving Field Marshal Montgomery complete command over the entire northern sector. With Britain's famous Monty cleverly holding Rundstedt back in the north, his American counterpart, General Bradley, blocks the Nazis in the south.
The first order of business, once the Germans had been stopped, was closing the hole in the American line where the 1st and 3rd armies were wedged apart. Eisenhower's plan was to join the two armies quickly and then push east. Patton wanted to make a bolder move, but Eisenhower held him back.
Patton wanted desperately to drive right back up the original line and be met by a counterattack from the north and thus bag all of the Germans who'd gotten themselves forward in the Bulge, so-called Bulge. He wanted to cut them off and bag this lot. I still don't understand exactly why the decision was made, but rather than trying to cut these people off in a bag, the decision was made to push them out. So in effect, reserves were committed from the south, from the north, and from here, and the American army simply stood up and slugged its way back toward the start line. Slow, dogged, costly advance.
Both the enemy and the weather could kill you. If you were hit, you could go into shock, and in that temperature, you could freeze to death before they could get to you.
The first time I dug in, and I was digging my foxhole, and I threw my first shovel full of snow over, and I hit something, and I cleared the snow, and there laid a dead American soldier, froze, see. I mean, you say that could have been me, and I'm here now. We're here. This is the real thing.
The Americans attacked into the worst European winter in memory. But Eisenhower maintained his good cheer. He was a man who lived by numbers, and he knew those were on his side. In the European theater, the Allies held a 10-to-1 advantage in tanks, 3-to-1 in aircraft, 2.5-to-1 in troops. Ike poured 500,000 men into the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge would become the biggest, costliest battle in U.S. history. For many young Americans, their introduction to the raw experience of war.
Our first attack, major offensive, was on January the 7th. We moved up under artillery fire to an attack position, and we were hit from behind. And actually, it was one of our own companies in our battalion had gotten a little bit offline, and in the confusion of that was going on at that time, they mistook us for the Germans and started firing at us from the rear. After that was straightened out, then we began our attack on the woods, and then we came to a large open field. On the other side of the field was a large tank giving devastating fire into our ranks, and I think the Army terms it strategic withdrawal, but it really, we really just beat it out of there, and I was seeing people ahead of me falling and being hit, and so I went down on my face, and I looked at right in front of me. There was a friend of mine that had I could see had been killed. We probably had in the neighborhood of 200 people in the company, and at the end of that day, I understand about 64 were present. It was a real turning point in our life, because I don't think any of us have ever been the same after that day.
About midnight, I was sleeping. My buddy was on duty, and somehow or other, the Germans got within 20 yards of our position. Gordon got ripped by a machine gun from roughly the left thigh through the right waist. He then told me that he was hit through the stomach as well. Well, when you're that far from your home base and it's snowing and the temperature is 0, you don't have a chance. We were cut off. The Germans had overrun our position, and we were in the foxhole by ourselves. So basically, we both knew he was going to die. We had no morphine. We couldn't ease it. And so I tried to knock him out. Took off his helmet, held his jaw up, and just whacked it as hard as I could, because he wanted to be put out. That didn't work, and so I hit him over the head with a helmet, and that didn't work. Nothing worked. He slowly froze to death, bled to death. The next morning, as we looked at our gear, it looked as if I had spent a day in a butcher shop. My clothes were all covered with blood. His clothes were all covered with blood. The territory we were in was all covered. It was a butcher shop.
The really hardest part of the fighting for the 101st was not during the time that we were on the defensive, even though we were surrounded. The most difficult fighting that we really had was when we were asked to go on the offensive. By this time, the Germans were on the defense, and they were trying their best to keep an opening so they could get their people out of the Bulge and back to Germany.
The German generals knew their army was overextended and badly exposed. They wanted to pull their men quickly across the Rhine to the safety of the homeland. Hitler refused. On January 8th, he reluctantly allowed his men to inch back, but there would be no, and they opened up enough of a hole for the press to squeeze through, along with the morale troops and the medal pinners. McAuliffe and the 101st were the pride of the American army. But the price of an earlier pride was also on display.
The German offensive stalled out. The Allies held the northern shoulder. In the south, the southern shoulder was held. The Germans were constricted to that 80-mile base. And driving toward Antwerp, they got no farther than just within sight of the Meuse River. Net effect was it died.
Had gambled everything in the Ardennes, his best troops, his new reserves, hundreds of new tanks, and his meager supply of fuel. But he'd always known that wasn't enough. He'd also counted on bad weather, and after 7 days, his luck had run out.
Right there. That was the end of it.
Patton's army got to Bastogne the day after Christmas.